Welcome back, everybody, joining us at FFA 2021, wherever you may be. I'm Stephen Sacker, and I hope that most of you have been following the course of our discussions through the day. And I will admit, it's a pretty intensive day we've been having at FFA 2021. We've had some fabulous discussions, but we do allow for breaks. I, for one, have just rushed out and had a shot of coffee. I hope some of you have done that too. If you have been with us since the start this morning, then I salute you and your fortitude. We've got about an hour and a half of discussion left, and I promise you we've got brilliant speakers for this last 90 minutes or so, so do not go away, because this is going to be a really important part of today's event. Now, through this overarching theme of food system renewal, we, through the course of the day, have talked about global leadership, where it's coming from, what we need from our leaders, how we all have a stake in this food system renewal theme. We've also talked about the specifics of the climate change challenge, building resilience into food systems. We've also, in our most recent discussion, focused in on delivering healthy, nutritious food to all corners of the world. Getting that right is such a massive challenge, but so very important. Right now, we're going to drill down into something that is very current and which has perhaps lessons and implications that we can carry forward. That is the way the world has been changed by the COVID-19 pandemic. What we can learn from that for this longer-term structural discussion about food system renewal, how the two might be interlinked. And there is no better person to discuss that with, and I genuinely mean this, no better person, I think, in the world to discuss this with than my next guest. He is Dr. David Nabarro. He's the UN World Health Organization Special Envoy, specifically assigned onto the COVID-19, the global pandemic crisis. He is a doctor who has spent his entire life in the field of international public health, one of the most important and leading voices in public health. He's particularly, throughout his career, focused on the challenges that come with climate change and with feeding the world. So David Nabarro is incredibly well qualified to tie together some of the themes I've just talked about. David, I can see you on my screen. I hope you can hear me. Give us the benefit of your immediate experience with COVID and your longer term experience in thinking about the most effective ways to feed the world. What lessons do you think we can learn from the way the world has responded to the global pandemic?
Thank you, Stephen. These are absolutely massive and really important questions. They have bearing on the future of our world and the life experiences of hundreds of millions of people. I will try to do justice to your questions in just a really short period of time. The COVID-19 pandemic, which is very much active right now, it's nowhere near finished, is showing us some of the frailties of our society and the vulnerabilities of systems on which we depend. One of the vulnerabilities is food systems. Here, there are three things that I'd like to pick out. Firstly, as a result of COVID-19, governments have had to reduce people's movement to try to stop the virus from spreading. But by reducing movement, they've also restricted the ability of people, particularly poor people, to earn money. So we've had a huge increase in income poverty, and that has played through in many parts of the world to food poverty, because people have not been able to buy the food they need. We saw this in a very dramatic way last year in India, when there was a quite rapid imposition, correctly, of a movement restriction, but that had big knock-on impact for millions, and we're talking about multiple millions of people. We've also seen how when movement is restricted and children don't go to school, that children don't get their midday meals, so they in turn get less nutrition. So there's an immediate impact on hunger. Then secondly, farmers just can't sell their produce in the way they're used to, because when you get movement restrictions, and in particular the closing of shops, that means that the market for perishable produce from farms is reduced, like milk is thrown away, vegetables have to be ploughed back into the ground. And this is very bad for smallholders. We've seen numerous instances of millions of farmers experiencing a tough time last year. And thirdly, supply chains get disrupted, and particularly long supply chains. Altogether, there have been vulnerabilities revealed through COVID. And right now, the effort has to be on ensuring that in any effort to improve food systems, we're also dealing with those vulnerabilities. As we're planning for a summit that's taking place in September this year on the future of food systems, we will be learning from COVID's impact to try to make them more resilient and less susceptible to damage in the way that we've seen.
It's interesting, David, because as you say, there is this food systems summit coming up later in the year, and I know you're involved in that. But, you know, I'm also well aware from my long experience talking to politicians that, you know, they only have so much sort of bandwidth to deal with crises at any one time. Do you worry that because 2021 is going to be so dominated by global response to the COVID pandemic that eyes may be taken off the ball when it comes to this longer term structural set of issues that go with ensuring the world is fed properly, and that, you know, everything around the Global Food Summit is addressed by leaders at the very top?
Stephen, I'd wondered about this, and certainly when I was getting ready to support Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the special envoy for the Food Summit, who I think has been featuring in FFA, I noticed that there was a potential clash between a focus on food and a focus on health. But you know, the more I've listened to government ministers talking about their food challenges in the last year, the more I have been convinced that they see the challenges posed by COVID and the issues around the functioning of food systems to be densely interrelated. After all, who gets hurt the most when food systems are not working properly? It's not people in your and my income bracket. It's the people who earn much, much less than us, because they are much more susceptible to the disturbance of systems than we are. And so they are at risk. Who gets disturbed the most by COVID? Answer, very poor people. All over the world, we're seeing COVID is a disease which hits those who are poorest much worse than those who are better off. And so what I'm finding is that many government ministers are saying that they feel they need to look at the food and nutrition aspects of COVID and the health aspects of COVID through the similar pair of spectacles, through similar lenses, because they see these as impacting on the same people in society. And I see that as a really good evolution, because if we are finding that there are certain groups in societies throughout the world who tend to be most hit by a health challenge or by a food challenge, then that immediately, I think, just shows us that we must concentrate on these people when it comes to planning interventions. And we must be sure that the interventions actually are connecting with the aspects of life that are most disturbed. So, for example, if there's going to be movement restriction because of COVID, let there at the same time be special attention to the food and nutrition needs of poor populations. Otherwise, they get hit both by poverty and by hunger and malnutrition, which is a kind of double whammy.
Yeah, that's a very important point. It seems to me, you know, one thing the COVID crisis has shown everybody around the world is that the old cliche about, we're all in this together is really very true when it comes to COVID-19, because however well any particular nation state is doing in controlling the virus, in keeping its healthcare systems running efficiently, and indeed rolling out a vaccine, however well a nation state is doing, the problem, the overall global problem, isn't resolved until all nations are delivering on that, because as long as the virus is thriving somewhere, it continues to threaten all of us. Now, I just wonder if there are parallels to be drawn with hunger and with food systems on that basis. Do you think that finally political leaders and indeed citizens around the world are understanding that when it comes to food systems, we are also all in it together, that if there is hunger and a failure of the food system in one part of the world, it actually affects all of us, because it's going to affect trade, it's going to have knock-on effects in different parts of the food system network. Do you think that the interconnectedness is coming home to people in a new way?
Oh, Stephen, gosh, you are so articulate on this. I wish you could be saying this all the time, including on Hard Talk program I love so much. Stephen, there's always going to be a number of people in our world who get it that the world is one place, and we really have to look at the well-being of all world citizens when we're thinking about the future. Now, the question that I am constantly troubled by is, have we seen an increase in the numbers of people who understand this to a point where it's enough to persuade political leaders that a one world view is the only way to go? Well, I think it's moving, but it's not moving enough. So there's been a huge amount of discussion in the last 2.5 months about how the world should use the very limited amount of vaccine for COVID-19 virus that's around. And the right answer has to be that the limited vaccine should be shared in response to need among all countries. And it should go to people who need it the most within those countries, rather than a few countries taking whatever vaccine is available to vaccinate all their people and everybody else scrabbling around trying to get vaccine wherever they can. There could have been a global approach, and it would have made such a difference to the world's perception of itself, and I actually believe younger people's view of what good governance actually stands for. But we missed the opportunity. There has been a huge race to try to get vaccine by a small number of countries, and there is a big inequity. But I don't think it has to stay like that. I think it's a bit unfortunate the way in which vaccine rollout has been taken, but I think there's plenty of opportunity to rethink it. And the same applies when I'm talking about food and food systems. I think there's a much greater understanding everywhere that what happens in one part of the world when it comes to growing food is relevant in other parts of the world where food is eaten, because when it comes to food, we are all part of one big family. And the impact of food production systems, particularly negative impacts, aren't just local, they can expand and be global. For example, the climate change impacts of food actually affect the whole world. And so I believe that there's a growing recognition about these interconnections. I think that political leaders are listening much more, including in the G7 and the G20. The question is, are they listening enough? And only future generations will be able to tell. The results of work that are taking place now in 2021 will play through, I believe, by 2030. And so the work of people like myself will be judged, I hope quite harshly, by the time we reach 2030, when those who do the evaluations then will say, did they get it right? I really hope we have, because I can just say one thing that I'm absolutely convinced of, and that is that unless we approach issues like COVID or issues like global food security from a one world perspective, we will still end up with these massive differences in the opportunities and well-being of people in different parts of the world. And that inequity is not good for the future. You cannot deal with big threats like climate change or like the destruction of nature in a world where access to precious resources is so unevenly distributed between different groups of people.
Right, and that message about interconnectedness comes across loud and clear, David. But in the course, you haven't obviously been with us all day. You've got other stuff to do. But in the course of today, from the very beginning, with a special message we got from Antonio Guterres to different contributors talking about the global scene, we've heard that between 650 and 800 million people are living with the day-to-day reality of hunger as we speak. And there's been an interesting discussion here at the Forum on the Future of Agriculture about how you balance the need to reach those people with adequate food supplies as quickly as possible, while also respecting the needs of the planet in terms of the climate change agenda. That is, developing a food system network and agriculture that is more sustainable and less damaging in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. How do you balance out those priorities? Do you see them as in some senses contradictory, or do you believe that they can be harnessed together?
Stephen, I'm not sure how closely they are linked to each other. Let me explain. Actually, in our world today, we produce plenty of food. In fact, we produce a lot more food than we actually need because we waste approximately 1/3 of all the food that is produced. And we still have enough overall to feed everybody. That leads me to conclude that increasing the amount of food that is produced is not in itself going to lead to the 700 million people who are hungry suddenly having more food. It's not going to work like that. The reason is that the increasing numbers of hungry people in our world are not hungry because of an overall lack of food, but they're hungry because in the particular areas where they live, for a mix of reasons, they are unable to access the food they require to be able to live and grow well. And that's sometimes a deliberate decision, and it's sometimes one of those things that's happened as a result of a combination of circumstances which has left people without food, really as what one sometimes refers to as an accidental outcome. Either way, simply putting more food into the system will not necessarily increase their ability to eat. And so I like to really look at hunger through two different perspectives. Perspective one is those people who are unable to access enough to eat and analysing very carefully what the underlying causes are and finding that usually they are either conflict or climate change or a combination of the two. And they need to be dealt with through locally specific action. Whereas the broader question of food production systems and their impact on the planet, their impact on the environment, their impact on the atmosphere, that is a major issue and that needs to be looked at as a challenge in its own right and factored into all decisions about the future of food systems. As we get closer to the summit that takes place in September this year, I believe we're going to see a lot more appreciation of the interconnectedness you just spoke about and of the reality that when we're dealing with food, it truly is a systems challenge which means it is necessary to be able to understand the complexity and to disaggregate the nature of the challenge in different settings. And that's where I want really laser-like focus on what are the reasons why so many people are currently hungry and malnourished in our world where there's plenty of food to go around. Let's get the reasons out into the open and let's deal with them place by place rigorously. And that's something that Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, as you know, has been really pushing for in the light of COVID.
A final thought. We've only got 30 seconds, David, so you're going to have to be really brief, but I just want to get a thought from you on it. Do you think, and COVID has been a tragedy for millions of people. We have seen far more than 1 million deaths. We've seen tens of millions of people get ill, and many of them very seriously ill with it. As you said, it's still unfolding. It is very, very far from over. But nonetheless, do you think there is a way in which we can see the COVID pandemic crisis as perhaps a vital wake-up call for all of us about the way in which we balance out the different priorities we have on this planet between, you know, our desire for economic growth, our desire for ever more in terms of material stuff, and our balance with the natural world and the planet? Do you think we can learn lessons from this that will be very useful, whether it be in food systems or a whole host of other ways going forward?
Well, I hope that we will learn lessons from what COVID has taught us. One, equity is key. Two, we really do need to understand that sustainability is also vital, and that all of the major issues for the future interconnected. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about. And so please, it would be absolutely a tragedy if we were not to learn the lessons through COVID and apply them to other existential threats like the damage to nature and like climate change.
David, we really appreciate you taking time out during what has to be a very stressful and busy day job dealing with the pandemic at the World Health Organization. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Thank you very much for joining us from Geneva.
Thank you, Stephen, and wonderful, wonderful program from FFA. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah, bye-bye, David. Thank you very much.